Hello and welcome. I'm Mr. Luis, and today we're exploring one of the foundational aspects of psychology research experiments. In this video, we'll cover how experiments are designed, the types of variables involved, and the key experimental designs that help researchers investigate cause and effect relationships. We'll also explore the ethics of experiments and how researchers ensure their studies are both scientifically valid and ethically sound. Let's dive right in. What is an experiment? An experiment is an investigation designed to test a cause and effect relationship. The goal of an experiment is to determine how one variable, the independent variable, or IV, affects another variable, the dependent variable, or DV. For example, in an experiment investigating the effect of lighting conditions, the IV on attention, the DV, the researcher manipulates the lighting conditions to see how this changes the participant's ability to focus. The key to this is understanding the relationship between the IV and the DV. If the researcher finds a significant difference in the DV due to changes in the IV, they can conclude that the IV caused the change in the DV. This experimental setup allows researchers to make cause and effect conclusions, which is what makes experiments one of the most powerful research methods in psychology. Key terms to know: independent variable, IV. The factor the researcher manipulates, for example, lighting conditions; dependent variable, DV, the factor being measured, for example, level of attention. So, let's talk about types of variables and conditions. In an experiment, researchers compare different levels or conditions of the independent variable. These levels can be, two or more options that are tested against each other. One condition often serves as a control condition, where the independent variable is absent or set to a baseline level. For instance, in a lighting experiment, one condition might involve bright lighting, another dull lighting, and the control condition might have no lighting change, like just regular daylight. It's essential to keep uncontrolled variables to a minimum, since they can really distort the results. These are factors that could influence the dependent variable but are not actually part of the experiment. For example, a participant's recent meal could affect their attention, so that kind of thing must be controlled. Now let's look at experimental designs. There are three main types of experimental designs. Alright, so let's talk about independent measures design. In this design, different participants are used for each level of the independent variable. For example, if we're testing different lighting conditions, one group of participants may experience bright lighting while another group experiences dull lighting. This design, really minimizes the impact of order effects, where performance might improve with repetition, because each participant only experiences one condition. Now, moving on to repeated measures design. This design involves using the same participants for all conditions of the independent variable. Each participant is exposed to every level of the independent variable. So for instance, they might first test the bright lighting and later test the dull lighting. This design helps control for individual differences between participants, but it may introduce order effects such as fatigue or practice effects. And finally, let's discuss matched pairs design. This method involves pairing participants who are similar on relevant characteristics, like age or intelligence, and assigning each participant to different conditions of the independent variable. This helps control for individual differences and honestly allows researchers to compare results more accurately. Alright, let's talk about some key terms you'll need to know. So, a control condition is basically a condition where the independent variable is absent or set to a baseline level. Order effects refer to changes in participant performance that are caused by the order in which conditions are experienced. And finally, confounding variables are those uncontrolled variables that might affect the dependent variable and, confound the results. Now let's move on to non-directional, directional, and null hypotheses. In an experiment, researchers make predictions that guide their studies, often in the form of hypotheses. There are three main types of hypotheses used in psychological research. So let's dive into the non-directional or two-tailed hypothesis. This type of hypothesis predicts that there will be a difference between conditions, but it doesn't actually predict the direction of the difference. For example, you might say there will be a difference in how well students using revision apps learn compared to those using mind maps. The researcher does not specify which group will perform better. Okay, so let's talk about the directional or one-tailed hypothesis. A directional hypothesis predicts the direction of the effect, specifying which condition will lead to a higher or lower dependent variable. For example, you might say, students using revision apps will learn better than students using mind maps. This kind of hypothesis is typically used when previous research suggests a clear direction for the effect. Now moving on to the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis suggests that any observed difference between conditions is actually just due to chance. It basically says that no real effect is happening, and any variation in the dependent variable is simply random. The null hypothesis gets tested statistically, and if the results show a significant effect, then the null hypothesis is rejected. And finally, let's touch on ethics in experiments. Research in psychology must always adhere to ethical guidelines to ensure the welfare of participants. There are quite a few ethical considerations that researchers have to balance, especially in experiments where participants might not know they are part of the study, or where some deception is necessary to avoid demand characteristics. So, participants must know enough about the study to decide whether they want to participate. This is what we call informed consent. And if deception is involved, like, say, withholding the true purpose of the experiment, participants must be thoroughly debriefed afterward. Participants must be informed that they can leave the study at any time without facing consequences. This is, part of their right to withdraw from the experiment. Researchers must ensure that participants are not exposed to any greater physical or psychological risks than they would normally encounter in their daily life. So, this means researchers have to be cautious about causing stress or discomfort during the experiment. So let's talk about types of experiments. Experiments can be conducted in laboratories or field settings, and, each of these has its own strengths and weaknesses. In laboratory experiments, researchers control all variables to make sure that the only factor affecting the dependent variable is the independent variable. These experiments, they allow researchers to establish clear cause and effect relationships, but they might lack ecological validity because honestly the lab environment is kind of artificial. So let's talk about field experiments. Field experiments take place in natural settings like, say, a school or a park, where participants behave in their usual environment. These experiments have higher ecological validity because the conditions are more natural, but honestly they are more challenging to control and replicate. Now, applying your knowledge of experiments to new research is super important. As you can see, experiments are a powerful tool in psychology research, allowing us to investigate cause and effect relationships. However, they do come with ethical considerations and design challenges. As you continue studying psychology, you'll need to be able to identify which experimental designs and hypotheses are most suitable for various research questions and scenarios. All right, to sum up, experiments are essential in psychology for understanding cause and effect relationships. By carefully designing experiments, choosing appropriate hypotheses, and maintaining ethical standards, researchers can gain insights that contribute to psychological theory and practice. So, make sure to apply your understanding of these concepts in future research or exams, and always be mindful of the ethical guidelines that ensure the welfare of participants. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you now feel more confident in understanding experimental design and the ethics behind it. Stay tuned for more in-depth discussions on research methods in psychology.